Okay, so today we're going to discuss the rise of dictators, in particular, the rise of dictators in Europe. We're going to look at three leaders in particular: Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. All have enormous impacts on their individual countries as well as the whole of Europe, and are all part of the story of World War II. Uh, Stalin takes over the Soviet Union in 1924. The original leader of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin, who was the leader of the Communist Revolution in the Soviet Union and Russia at the time, that overthrew the czars, dies in 1924, and Stalin whittles his way into power. And one of the first things Stalin does is he abolishes private farms. In other words, if you owned property and you had lived on that land and you farmed that land was no longer yours. It belonged to the government. And Stalin turned these farms into what were known as collectives. And these were large government owned farms worked by many different families. So, imagine in your neighborhood, rather than just being a series of homes, you were a series of farms, and whatever you farmed went to the greater good, so to speak. And if you grew more crops than your neighbors, it didn't matter. You didn't get to benefit from that. The government did. And the government would set quotas for what people needed to do in these farms and what they needed to produce, whether they were producing grain or potatoes or whatever it was. The government said, you got to give this much of what you grow to the government, and then you can keep the rest. And this is where so much of the economic activity of the Soviet Union is directed under the state, under the government of the Soviet Union. And this is the big failure of democracy. You can see here, this is what a collective farm kind of looked like. And many different families all working together, all trying to grow together and allow for them to be somewhat prosperous, but the state was going to come in and take so much of what they earned. And the real downside for a lot of these people, unfortunately, was that the government would take so much food that there wasn't enough left for them to make, to eat themselves. And you have mass starvations at these collective farms. You have, people that are really struggling to get by and make it. And the government inspectors would come and, they knew that there was a lack of food. And if you look like you didn't have a lack of food, that must mean you were stealing, and you could potentially be arrested, thrown to a prison in Siberia, or executed. But this ushers in the era of totalitarianism, where the government exerts complete control over its citizens, and Stalin was certainly in that category. He would eliminate anyone that threatened his power. If somebody was potentially going to harm his leadership, or speak out against him, they wouldn't be speaking very long after that. And they estimate Stalin was responsible for 8 to 13 million deaths. Some have it as high as 20 million. Many people think of Hitler as being the worst person in history, and while that certainly very valid arguments to make that, Stalin isn't far behind. Stalin is responsible for tens of millions of deaths, and not from war or anything like that. These are just people that he either had killed, or his policies were so brutal and ruthless that it led to people dying. And that was Stalin. There's a picture of Joseph Stalin with a big mustache and very very thick jaw there that you can see, and he was a ruthless individual, one of the worst people in history. The other dictator from this time period is Benito Mussolini. And Mussolini takes over because Italy is in a lot of trouble in the 1920s. They have a lot of high unemployment. They've got a lot of high inflation happening throughout the country. And there's a big struggle for them economically. And Mussolini's a powerful speaker. He knows how to get a message out. He knows how to get people to kind of listen to him and convince them of his policies and what he thinks they should do. And Mussolini introduces what's known as fascism, where the interests of the states are above those of the individual. Fascism is what is kind of the part of Nazism, but fascism was certainly what the Italian government was under. It calls for a single leader, a dictator, and by doing this, Mussolini is able to restructure Italy, and he does make a lot of improvements. And this is where, the kind of interesting thing and the difference between the United States in many cases historically and other countries. People of Italy were willing to give up a lot of personal rights, a lot of individual rights, a lot of economic rights because the improvements were made. There was food on their table. Many people often said about Mussolini, he made the trains run on time, because that's how inefficiently things were run in Italy at that time. That you couldn't even count on the trains working and being there on time. So Mussolini got a lot of credit for that, and with that came his ability to take his power further and further. And there's a picture of Mussolini. Il Duce was his nickname, the leader. He had a brand of he had like a personal military, basically called the Black Shirts, similar to the Nazi stormtroopers. Mussolini had his black shirts that, kind of did his bidding, so to speak. Now is the other one, and most of you are very well aware of the things that Hitler did. After World War One, Germany is in a very bad state. They create what's called the Weimar Republic, and this was the new government of Germany after World War One, and one they hoped would bring a long-term government, so to speak, for Germany. But because of the reparations and other economic problems in Germany, they go through a period of hyperinflation. Part of that is their own fault. To deal with this, they printed way more money than they should have. They devalued their own currency significantly, and it brings a very, very tough situation for the German people. And the peace settlement caused a lot of this, and that resentment towards Europe, towards England, for what had happened in the Treaty of Versailles. That is very much on the minds of a lot of and one person in particular was Adolf Hitler. Hitler's an army corporal in World War One, never becomes an officer or anything like that. It's just a corporal, the next to lowest level in the military. But after World War One, he's infuriated by the Treaty of Versailles. Very angered, wanted the Germans to not agree to that, felt that they should have fought rather than gone through everything with it. What Hitler winds up doing is he begins to speak out publicly. He begins to listen to different people, the kind of early Nazis, and they're blaming Jews, they're blaming different groups, they're blaming different things for why Germany is struggling. And Hitler latches on to this. He's a starving artist. He's really kind of lost his way. He's, methodically moving around Germany. But he's going and he's listening to these different people speak about, about the problems of Germany. And he starts to kind of agree with it, and he begins to speak himself. He goes into these beer halls in Germany, and he's a powerful speaker. He's got a real natural knack for it. And they eventually lead to try to overthrow the Weimar Republic. They actually have a rebellion that fails. Hitler's arrested. Hitler's put on trial. He goes to jail, except that at his trial, he was so convincing that they kind of gave him a slap on the wrist. So he goes into prison. He writes his book, Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle, and it outlines what Germany needs to do to become a world power. People are reading this, and Hitler's gaining popularity. And this is all about what is known as Nazism, and this is the German brand of fascism. Here's a picture of a Nazi rally. This is, later on. This isn't before Hitler took over power, but this is, what the movement. So in 1932, as the Depression is worldwide, Germany has high unemployment as well. And as a result of this, the Nazi Party is continuing to gain power. At this time, what the Nazis refer to their congresses is as the Reichstag. And, political parties, we often talk about third parties and how, the kind of how we want more third party choices, so to speak, in this country. And we often think of this as at the presidency, but really what needs to happen is, we need to get, third party candidates like libertarians into congressional seats if you want a third party to really truly rise. And that's what the Nazi Party does. They gain seats year after year. They gain more seats and gain more power in the Reichstag. And that eventually leads to them kind of really having the ability to dismantle the current government, put Hitler in as prime minister, give him all kinds of emergency powers, and allow Hitler to be the dictator that he was aiming to be. He dismantles the government, establishes the Third Reich, and now, this is how we set the stage for the three most ruthless dictators of the 20th century to be in power and cause a lot of the issues that take place, before, during, and after World War II.